Banks built without stone. They had no grand facades, no columns, no vaults guarded by iron doors. And yet, these banks outlasted empires, financed wars, and moved fortunes across Europe without ever needing a single building to prove they existed. To understand how banks could exist without stone, we must return to a time when permanence was dangerous. Cities burned, borders shifted, confiscation followed every regime change. Wealth tied to a location was wealth waiting to be seized. So the most resilient financial institutions learned to disappear, physically, while remaining fully operational. The first reveal begins with networks rather than structures. These banks were families, partnerships, and correspondence chains spread across cities and ports. Value was not stored in vaults, but in obligations mirrored across ledgers held in different places. If one node fell, another carried the record forward. The bank did not live in stone. It lived in agreement. The second beat follows how trust replaced architecture. Clients did not walk in the halls to see their wealth. They trusted names, signatures, and reputation earned over decades. Transfers occurred through letters, coded phrases, and balances adjusted across books. Money moved faster than soldiers, and safer than gold ever could. What made this powerful was invisibility. Armies could seize buildings. Rulers could confiscate treasure. But they could not easily destroy a system that had no single center. The bank existed wherever its records were honored, and nowhere a crown could point to. By the time authorities realized what had happened, it was too late. Financial power had detached itself from place. Control of stone no longer meant control of money. And in that detachment, Europe entered a new era, one where the strongest institutions were the hardest to see. As the reveal deepened, the advantage of these invisible banks became unmistakable. While rulers fought to protect treasuries and vaults, wealth already moved elsewhere. A city could fall in a week, but obligations recorded across 5 ports could not be conquered so easily. Loss in one place was offset by continuity in another. Survival was built into the design. The conflict emerged when states attempted to regulate what they could not locate. Edicts demanded registration. Taxes were imposed on assets no one could inventory. Officials searched for headquarters that did not exist. In response, banks adjusted routes, renamed partnerships, and shifted correspondence. Compliance was selective. Visibility was optional. What unsettled authorities most was not evasion, but effectiveness. These banks financed trade when official institutions failed. They stabilized exchange during wars that emptied state coffers. Rulers borrowed from them while publicly condemning them. Dependence grew alongside resentment. Power knew it was losing control, but could not afford to sever the relationship. The buildup intensified as clients recognized the difference. Wealth placed in stone-bound institutions vanished with conquest. Wealth entrusted to networks survived. Merchants, nobles, and even governments began preferring banks that could not be captured. Security was no longer physical. It was relational. Over time, the invisible banks refined their systems. Redundancy increased. Records were mirrored. Authority was decentralized deliberately. No single partner knew everything. Trust was distributed to prevent collapse or betrayal. What looked chaotic was carefully engineered resilience. By this stage, the transformation was complete. Banking had separated itself from territory. Value moved through systems immune to borders. States could tax trade, but not fully control it. They could regulate buildings, but not networks built on agreement alone. The age of stone banks was ending, and with it, the assumption that power could always be found where money was stored. The tension sharpened when invisible banks began shaping politics as much as commerce. Rulers discovered that access to these networks determined whether armies were paid, supplies moved, and alliances held. Credit decided outcomes before battles were fought. Power no longer asked where the bank was. It asked whether the bank would answer. The conflict escalated as states tried to force visibility. Some demanded hostages. Others required senior partners to swear loyalty. A few attempted outright seizures of known intermediaries. Each tactic failed in a different way. Arrested partners were replaced. Confiscated books proved incomplete. Loyalty oaths meant little when authority changed again months later. The network absorbed pressure and continued functioning. The buildup intensified during periods of collapse. When monarchies fell and republics rose, invisible banks did not choose sides. They paused, recalculated, and resumed with whoever could honor obligations. This neutrality was not moral. It was structural. Survival depended on flexibility, not allegiance. And flexibility made them indispensable. Clients began to understand the implication. Banking was no longer an extension of sovereignty. It was a parallel system that outlasted it. Governments negotiated terms not as masters, but as participants seeking access. Influence shifted quietly from those who ruled land to those who maintained continuity. By now, a subtle fear spread through halls of power. Institutions without buildings could not be stormed. Wealth without location could not be besieged. Control through force had lost its primary target. The visible instrument of authority, courts, armies, borders, no longer aligned with where financial decisions were actually made. What emerged was a new imbalance. States still govern people, but networks govern value. And once value learns how to move without walls, the world that depended on walls begins to change. The reckoning came slowly as rulers adjusted to a reality they could no longer reverse. Banking without stone had not weakened authority outright, but it had redefined its limits. Power learned that it could demand taxes, pass laws, and raise armies, yet still depend on systems it did not fully command. The climax unfolded when states stopped trying to capture invisible banks and began trying to host them. Privileges were offered, legal protections extended. Courts adapted procedures to recognize obligations recorded elsewhere. Instead of forcing networks into walls, governments reshaped themselves to remain relevant within them. Authority followed value, not the other way around. The resolution transformed European finance permanently. Over time, states built hybrid institutions, banks with buildings for visibility, but networks for resilience. Regulation shifted from seizure to coordination. Control gave way to oversight. The lesson had been learned the hard way. Systems that survive disruption cannot be governed through force alone. What endured was not the disappearance of stone banks, but their evolution. Buildings remained symbols. Networks remained engines. Power adapted by acknowledging that trust, redundancy, and distributed memory were stronger foundations than walls ever had been. This story leaves behind a quiet truth that still shapes the modern world. The most powerful financial institutions are not those with the largest vaults, but those that can continue operating when vaults no longer matter. And once money learns how to move without walls, it never fully returns to them. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. Banks